The radar screen flickered in the pre-dawn darkness of Bagram Airfield, and Senior Master Sergeant Viktor Kozlov leaned closer, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Something wasn't right. The blip that should have represented Hog 7-2 had vanished from his display 3 minutes ago, right over the Korangal Valley, a place they called the Valley of Death for good reason. He toggled through frequencies, his thick fingers surprisingly deft on the controls. Static, then more static. He tried the emergency channel. Nothing. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in that particular way that meant he was already writing the casualty report in his head. Webb had seen 43 aircraft go down in his career. He knew the signs. The silence that followed a disappearance over hostile territory was always the same, absolute, damning, final. He reached for the phone to call the commander. Kozlov held up one finger, asking for another moment, still cycling through frequencies. But Webb shook his head. The protocol was clear. After 5 minutes of no contact over enemy territory, you started making the calls. You notified the chain of command. You prepared the team for recovery operations if recovery was even possible. You certainly didn't hope. Not in a place like this. The commander's voice crackled through the phone line with the kind of exhaustion that came from too many notifications, too many folded flags. "Say again, Marcus." Webb cleared his throat. "Sir, Hog 7-2, no contact for 6 minutes. Last known position was Grid November Tango 47, deep in the Korangal. We're calling it." There was a long pause. In that pause lived all the weight of command, the knowledge that somewhere a family would soon receive a visit from men in dress uniforms. "Understood," the commander finally said. "No pilot survived that, not with those mountains, not with Taliban crawling over every ridge." Webb hung up and stared at the map on the wall, at the red pin marking where Hog 7-2 had been escorting a convoy through an ambush. He thought about the pilot, about the personnel file he'd reviewed just yesterday. He thought about the way some people in the squadron still whispered, still doubted. Then Kozlov's voice cut through the dark operations center like a knife. "Sir, you need to hear this." Webb turned. The sergeant had gone pale, his headset pressed so hard against his ear it was leaving a red mark. "I've got something on guard frequency. It's faint, but—" He switched it to speakers. Through the wash of static came a voice, ragged, strained, but unmistakably human. Any station, this is Hog 7-2. I'm coming home. Somebody better have the runway clear." Webb's coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the concrete floor. The voice was wrong. It should have been silent. It should have been gone. 20 miles out, an A-10 Thunderbolt II clawed through the mountain air on one engine, and a prayer trailing smoke like a funeral shroud. Captain Raven Kowalczyk didn't believe in ghosts, but she was starting to think she might become one. The aircraft shuddered beneath her, every rivet screaming, every surface pockmarked with holes that whistled as the thin mountain air rushed through them. Her right engine was gone, completely seized after taking a rocket-propelled grenade at an angle that should have been impossible. The left engine was running at 60%, coughing like a chain smoker, and her hydraulics were failing in increments that made each control input feel like arm wrestling with God. She'd been over the Korangal providing close air support for a convoy when the ambush erupted from 3 sides simultaneously. She'd seen the RPGs coming up, had thrown the aircraft into a defensive spiral, but one had clipped her anyway, and the world had turned into fire and alarms, and the sickening lurch of an aircraft that no longer wanted to fly. She should have ejected. Every manual, every instructor, every veteran pilot who'd survived long enough to lecture the next generation would have told her to pull the handles and trust the parachute. But the convoy below was still taking fire. She could see the desperate suppressive bursts from their positions, could see Taliban fighters maneuvering for better angles. If she left, if she punched out and let the aircraft tumble into the mountainside, those soldiers would die. So she'd made a choice that probably qualified as insanity. She'd stayed in the seat, killed her wounded engine before it could catch fire and turned the whole bird into a fireball, and dumped every remaining round from her cannon into the enemy positions until the gun went silent and the barrel glowed cherry red in the dawn light. The convoy had broken contact. They were running for safety now, and she was alone with a dying aircraft and 40 miles of the most unforgiving terrain in Afghanistan between her and anything resembling safety. Her hands were steady on the stick despite everything, despite the pain radiating from her left shoulder where shrapnel had found its way through a seam in her survival vest, despite the blood that made her glove slick. She'd learned steadiness a long time ago, back when she was the only woman in flight school, and every mistake was amplified, examined, used as evidence that she didn't belong. She'd learned to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified. She'd learned to swallow her fear and fly like fear was for other people. Call sign Raven hadn't been her choice. It had been given to her by an instructor who'd said she had eyes like a bird of prey and the stubbornness of a scavenger. She'd taken it as an insult at first, until she'd learned that ravens were survivors, problem solvers, creatures that thrived where others gave up. Now, skimming over ridgelines with her right wing dipping because the trim was shot to hell, she embodied that call sign completely. Bagram Tower, Hog 7-2, requesting emergency straighten approach, runway 21. I am single engine, multiple systems failures, declare emergency. Her voice was calm, professional, like she was requesting a change in altitude rather than announcing she was flying a shredded wreck that barely qualified as an aircraft anymore. The tower controller's voice came back, and she could hear the disbelief in it. Hawk 7-2, Bagram Tower, say your position and status. We were told you were down. Raven allowed herself the smallest bitter smile. Of course they were told she was down. The moment something went wrong, the moment a female pilot was in trouble, the assumption was always that she'd failed, that she'd proven the doubters right. Never mind that she'd been flying combat missions for 3 years with a perfect record. Never mind that she'd logged more hours in the A-10 than half the squadron combined. One bad situation, and suddenly it was confirmation bias in action. Tower, I'm 15 miles out, heading 210, altitude Angels 8 and descending. I've got battle damage, one engine out, hydraulics failing, probably more holes than airplane at this point. She paused, checking her instruments. And I've got about 10 minutes before this bird decides it's done flying, so let's make this quick. There was a scramble of activity she could hear even over the radio, the tower alerting crash crews, the distinctive wail of sirens spinning up in the distance, the urgent calls going out across all frequencies. She adjusted her heading slightly, favoring the working engine, feeling the aircraft want to yaw and resisting it with constant pressure on the rudder pedals. Her left leg was shaking with the effort, but she locked it down, forced it to obey. Not yet. Not until she was on the ground. She could fall apart then. Right now she was still flying. The sun was rising over the Hindu Kush, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose that would have been beautiful if she'd had any attention to spare for beauty. Instead, she focused on the numbers: airspeed, altitude, heading, engine temperature. The left engine was getting hotter, creeping toward the red line. If it seized or caught fire before she reached the runway, this was over. She'd have no choice but to eject, and the thought of doing that now, after everything, after getting this far, made something fierce and stubborn flare in her chest. She throttled back slightly, giving the engine a little mercy, trading airspeed for temperature. The aircraft sank in response, and she had to fight the instinct to pull back on the stick. No altitude to spare for instinct. Only math and physics now, only the cold calculation of glide ratios and descent rates. The radio crackled with Kozlov's voice, different now, urgent with something that might have been hope. Hawk 7-2, Bagram approach, we have you on radar. Runway is clear, all emergency equipment is standing by. Wind is 230 at 8 knots. You're cleared for any approach you can make. Raven clicked her mic twice in acknowledgement, too focused now for words. The airfield was visible ahead, a brown scar on the landscape, the runway a dark line stretching away like a promise. 5 miles. She could see the emergency vehicles lining the taxiway, could imagine the faces of the crews standing by with their foam and their tools, ready to cut her out if this went sideways. She could also imagine Webb and the commander, standing in the tower or in operations, watching this impossible return, possibly reconsidering the report they'd already started writing. The aircraft bucked suddenly, a violent shudder that rattled her teeth, and she felt something give way in the control system. Another cable parting, another hydraulic line failing. The stick went mushy in her hand, and for a heartbeat she thought this was it, that she'd pushed her luck too far and the airplane was going to quit on her within sight of safety. But she compensated, used trim and throttle, found a configuration that worked even if it was ugly. The aircraft steadied, still flying through sheer stubbornness. 3 miles. She started her descent, a shallow glide that kept her energy up but bled altitude steadily. The working engine was screaming now, hot enough that she could smell something acrid even through her oxygen mask. The temperature gauge was past red, into the unmarked territory where metal starts to remember it's supposed to be liquid. She feathered the throttle, trying to coax just a little more time from machinery that had already given everything and then some. 2 miles. She could see individual vehicles now, could see people standing outside them, watching her approach. The gear. She'd been avoiding thinking about the landing gear because if it didn't come down, if the hydraulics had failed too completely, then all of this was for nothing. She'd belly land on a concrete runway at 150 knots and hope the aircraft didn't cartwheel or explode. She reached for the gear handle, said a prayer to whatever gods watched over stubborn pilots, and pulled. There was an agonizing pause, a grinding sound that resonated through the entire airframe. Then, miraculously, 3 green lights. The gear was down and locked. 1 mile. She was over the threshold now, could see the numbers painted on the runway, could see the white-painted touchdown zone markers rushing toward her. The aircraft was barely responding anymore, wallowing through the air like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. Her airspeed was lower than she wanted, but she couldn't add power without the engine exploding, so she accepted it, compensated for it, planned for it. The runway rose up to meet her, and she flared, pulling the nose up in a textbook landing approach that was betrayed by the aircraft's refusal to fly textbook anymore. She hit hard, harder than any landing she'd made in 5 years, hard enough that she felt it in her spine, in her teeth. The nose gear slammed down a second later, and then she was decelerating, standing on brakes that barely worked, feeling the aircraft shimmy and shake as systems that had been held together by willpower alone started to give up. The left engine made a sound like a death rattle and seized completely. Smoke began pouring from it, thick and black. She steered toward the taxiway, still thinking about getting clear of the runway even though the immediate danger was over, still operating on training and protocol, because those things were reliable when everything else wasn't. The emergency vehicles were racing toward her now, their lights flashing in the morning sun. She brought the aircraft to a complete stop, went through the shutdown procedures even though half the switches didn't do anything anymore, and then just sat there for a moment, hands still on the controls, breathing hard through her mask. She'd made it. Against every reasonable expectation, against the commander's pronouncement, against the laws of physics and probability, she'd brought a broken aircraft home. Her hands started shaking then, the adrenaline finally catching up with her, and she had to grip the stick harder to make it stop. Not yet. Not until she was out. She reached up, slid the canopy open manually since the electric motor was dead, and was immediately hit with a wave of heat from the still-smoking engine. The rescue crews were there in seconds, ladders against the fuselage, hands reaching up to help her. She unbuckled with fingers that didn't want to cooperate, disconnected her oxygen and radio leads and let them guide her down. Her legs nearly gave out when she hit the ground, and 2 crew members caught her, held her steady while the world spun slightly. "Ma'am, are you injured? Can you walk?" She nodded, pulled off her helmet, and felt the cool morning air on her sweat-soaked hair. "I'm fine." "Check the bird, make sure that fire doesn't spread." They looked at her like she was insane. She probably was, but they moved to comply, dragging hoses toward the smoking engine while others surrounded her, checking for injuries, asking questions she barely heard. She was staring at her aircraft, at the A-10 that looked like it had flown through a shredder and somehow kept flying. There were holes everywhere. She started counting them and stopped at 30. The right engine housing was a blackened mess. The fuselage was scored with shrapnel impacts. Webb arrived in a vehicle that skidded to a stop on the taxiway, and he was out before it fully halted, striding toward her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Behind him, she could see other pilots emerging from the operations building, drawn by the impossible sight of Hog 72 on the ground instead of scattered across a mountainside. Webb stopped in front of her, looked her up and down, taking in the blood on her shoulder, the gray pallor under her tan, the way she was favoring her left leg, and then looked at the aircraft. He was silent for a long moment, and she braced herself for whatever was coming. Criticism for not ejecting, for risking the aircraft, for breaking some protocol she'd been too busy surviving to remember. Instead, he said quietly, "The commander said no pilot survived." Raven met his eyes, saw something in them she hadn't seen before. Not respect, not yet, but the beginning of it. "Respectfully, sir, the commander was wrong." Webb's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I'll make sure that makes it into the report." Then his expression hardened slightly. "You should have ejected." She didn't flinch. "There was a convoy taking fire, sir. If I'd left, they'd be dead." "If you'd stayed, you'd be dead. You got lucky." "Yes, sir, but the convoy didn't need luck. They needed cover, so I gave it to them." They stared at each other, and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or at least an acknowledgement that they were going to have to agree to disagree about what had happened up there. Webb finally nodded. "Get her to medical. I want a full check. And somebody find out how many rounds she put through that cannon, because the barrel looks like it went through hell." As the medics guided Raven toward an ambulance, she looked back one more time at her aircraft. The ground crew was already swarming over it, documenting damage, taking photographs, shaking their heads in disbelief. The word spread through Bagram like wildfire. By the time Raven was in the medical tent getting her shoulder stitched up, 8 pieces of shrapnel, the medic told her cheerfully, like it was a prize she'd won. Half the base knew the story. Hog 72 was back. The pilot everyone thought was dead had flown a destroyed A-10 home on one engine in pure spite. The details grew in the telling, the way they always did, but the core truth remained. Captain Raven Kowalczyk had done something that shouldn't have been possible. In the operations center, Kozlov pulled the radio recording and played it back for the gathered pilots. The sound of Raven's voice, calm and professional, requesting an emergency approach. The tower's disbelief. The steady updates as she closed on the field, each transmission betraying less and less functionality in the aircraft but never a hint of panic in the pilot. "She never wavered," Kozlov said, and there was something like awe in his voice. "One engine, half her flight controls gone, bleeding from a shrapnel wound, and she sounded like she was flying a training sortie." One of the younger pilots, Captain Derek Vaughn, call sign Hatchet, who'd been vocal about his skepticism regarding female combat pilots, stood at the back of the room. He'd made jokes in the past, nothing overtly cruel but enough to make his position clear. Now he stared at the recording equipment like it held answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. "How many rounds did she fire?" someone asked. Webb, who just entered, answered. "All of them. She emptied the cannon." 730mm shells into enemy positions while flying with catastrophic damage. The gun camera footage it's some of the most accurate fire I've ever seen under those conditions. The room was silent. In the A-10 community, the cannon was sacred. It was the reason the aircraft existed, the massive GAU-8 Avenger that could destroy anything on the ground. To empty it in defense of troops in contact, while wounded, while flying a dying aircraft, was the kind of thing that became legend. Hatchet spoke up, his voice quieter than usual. "I want to see the aircraft." Webb nodded. "They've got it in the maintenance hangar. Damage assessment is ongoing." The group moved as one, a procession of pilots in flight suits, walking across the tarmac to where Hog 72 sat in the harsh fluorescent lights of the hangar. Someone had put a ladder against the fuselage, and people were climbing up, peering into the cockpit, examining the damage up close. The sight silenced even the most talkative among them. The right side of the aircraft looked like it had been hit with a giant shotgun. The engine was a total loss, would have to be completely replaced. The fuselage skin was punctured in so many places that one maintainer joked they could use it as a colander. The hydraulic reservoir had been holed, leaving the cockpit floor slick with fluid. There was blood on the seat, not much but enough to be visible, dried brown in the desert heat. Hatchet climbed into the cockpit, sat in the pilot's seat where Raven had sat and put his hands on the controls. He tried to imagine flying this wreck, tried to imagine keeping it in the air for 40 miles, tried to imagine making a landing with systems failing in real time. He couldn't. His imagination wasn't big enough. He climbed back down, his expression thoughtful, and found Webb waiting at the base of the ladder. "Sir," he said, and had to clear his throat. "I owe Captain Kowalczyk an apology." Webb raised an eyebrow. "You can tell her yourself when she's back from medical." "Yes, sir, I will." Webb studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because she's going to be back in the air as soon as the flight surgeon clears her, and she's going to need a wingman who trusts her." The implication was clear. Trust wasn't optional anymore. It had been earned in blood and fire over the Korangal Valley, earned in the decision to stay when leaving would have been easier, earned in the impossible flight home. In the medical tent, Raven sat on a cot with her shoulder bandaged and her flight suit unzipped to the waist, an IV in her arm rehydrating her while a doctor checked her over one more time. She was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from extended combat and survival, but her mind was still racing, still replaying the mission. The convoy, had they made it? She grabbed a passing medic. The convoy from the Korangal, the one that was ambushed. Did they make it back? The medic looked confused, then understanding dawned. "You mean the one you were covering? Yeah, they radioed in about an hour ago. All personnel accounted for, they said. They said an A-10 saved their lives." Raven closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Worth it then. All of it had been worth it." "Ma'am," the medic asked. "You okay?" "Fine," she said, opening her eyes. "Just needed to know." The medic smiled. "They're calling you a hero, you know, the words all over base." She shook her head. "I was just doing my job." "Your job doesn't include flying a destroyed aircraft home. That was something else." Before Raven could respond, the tent flap opened and Lieutenant Colonel Webb entered, accompanied by a full colonel she recognized as the wing commander, Colonel James Garrett. Both men wore expressions that made her instantly straighten up despite her exhaustion. "Captain Kowalczyk," Garrett said, his voice formal but not cold. "Colonel," she responded, trying to stand. He waved her back down. "Stay seated, you've earned it." He pulled up a chair, sat across from her, and studied her with the kind of intensity that came from decades of evaluating pilots. "I'm told you chose not to eject when your aircraft was critically damaged over hostile territory." "Yes, sir. There were troops in contact. They needed support." "And you determined that your life was worth less than providing that support." Raven chose her words carefully. "I determined that I could still fly, sir, and that leaving meant soldiers would die, so I stayed." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You know what the book says about that situation?" "Yes, sir, the book says eject. And you disregarded that guidance." "I used my judgment, sir. I assessed the tactical situation and made the decision I thought was right." Another pause, longer this time. Webb stood silent beside the colonel, his expression unreadable. Finally, Garrett smiled just slightly. "Your judgment was correct. The convoy commander has already submitted a recommendation. 12 soldiers who were about to be overrun are alive because you stayed." He stood, and Raven tried again to stand with him, managing it this time despite the pull of stitches in her shoulder. "There's going to be an investigation, because there always is when someone breaks protocol and survives. But between you and me, Captain, that investigation is going to conclude that you did exactly what an A-10 pilot is supposed to do. You brought the gun to the fight, and you kept it there until the job was done." He extended his hand and she shook it, feeling the strength in his grip, the respect in the gesture. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. Just get healed up and get back in the air. We need pilots like you." After they left, Raven lay back on the cot and stared at the tent ceiling. "Pilots like you." For 3 years she'd been fighting to prove she was just like the other pilots, not better, not worse, just capable of doing the same job. Now suddenly she was being told she was like something else entirely. not because of her gender but because of what she'd done. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like exhaustion. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, dreaming of mountains and smoke and the sound of her aircraft's cannon, that beautiful, terrible thunder that meant someone below was going to live another day. 2 days later, she was back in the operations building, cleared for light duty but not yet for flight. Her shoulder still ached and the stitches pulled when she moved wrong, but she was restless sitting in her quarters and the flight surgeon had reluctantly agreed she could at least do ground work. She was reviewing weather reports when Hatchet approached, looking uncomfortable in a way that would have been amusing if she'd had the energy for amusement. "Captain Kowalczyk," he said formally. She looked up. "Hatchet. I wanted to talk to you, if you have a minute." She gestured to the empty chair across from her desk. He sat, and for a moment he just looked at his hands, clearly struggling with something. "I owe you an apology," he finally said, "for the comments I've made, for doubting you. I was wrong." Raven had imagined this moment back when the jokes and comments had stung worse than she'd ever let show. She'd imagined all the things she might say, the ways she might make him feel small the way he'd made her feel small. But now, sitting here with her shoulder aching and her aircraft in pieces in a hangar, she found she didn't have the energy for any of that. "Apology accepted," she said simply. He looked up surprised. "Just like that. Just like that. We're on the same team, Hatchet. We fly the same missions. I don't need you to grovel. I just need you to have my back up there." He nodded slowly. "You've got it. I promise you've got it." They shook hands and something that had been tense in the squadron began to ease. Not because one apology fixed everything, but because it was a start. Over the next few weeks, as Raven healed and her aircraft was repaired, a process that the maintainers described as basically building a new airplane around the data plate, the story continued to spread. It reached other bases, other commands, worked its way up the chain until someone at the Pentagon took notice. There was talk of a medal, of a formal commendation. Raven tried not to think about it, focused instead on her physical therapy, on regaining her strength, on preparing to fly again. When the day finally came that the flight surgeon cleared her for flight status, she walked to the operations building in the pre-dawn darkness, just like always, and found her name on the flight schedule. Hawk 72, the same tail number, repaired and ready. And beside her name as wingman was Hatchet. She smiled at that, a small private smile, and went to file her flight plan. In the hangar, the maintainers had done something she hadn't authorized but wouldn't have stopped if she'd known. Below the canopy rail in neat white stencil, they'd painted 32 small bombs, mission markers, one for each combat sortie she'd flown. And beside those, something new, a small raven black wing spread with a single star above it. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, found her standing there staring at the new artwork. "Hope you don't mind, ma'am," he said. Seemed like it needed to be there. "It's not regulation," she said, but her voice was soft. "Regulations can be flexible when you're a legend." She laughed at that, the first real laugh she'd had in weeks. "I'm not a legend, Rodriguez, I'm just a pilot." He smiled, and there was something knowing in it. "That's what all the legends say, ma'am." She climbed into the cockpit, this familiar space that had been rebuilt, refurbished, made whole again. The blood was gone from the floor, the controls moved smoothly, all the systems responded perfectly. But she could still feel the ghost of that flight, the memory of what this aircraft had survived. She strapped in, went through her pre-flight, and called for engine start. The turbines spooled up with that distinctive A-10 whine, and she felt it in her chest, felt it in her bones. This was where she belonged, not in the aftermath, not in the stories, but here, in the cockpit, with a mission ahead and the sky waiting. Hatchet's voice came through on the tactical frequency. "Hog 72, Hog 31, ready for taxi." "Copy that, 31. Let's go to work." They taxied together, two A-10s in the morning light, and when they reached the runway and were cleared for takeoff, Raven advanced the throttles and felt that familiar acceleration, that moment when the wheels left the ground and she was flying again. The mountains spread out below her, beautiful and deadly, the same mountains that had tried to kill her and failed. She banked toward her patrol area, Hatchet in perfect formation off her wing, and keyed the radio. "Bagram, Hog 72 is off and proceeding to station." "Roger, Hog 72. Good hunting." "Good hunting." She smiled behind her oxygen mask and pointed her aircraft toward the Koringal Valley, toward the place where she'd nearly died and where, she suspected, she'd really learned to live. The war would continue. There would be other missions, other close calls, other moments where the line between life and death was measured in seconds and decisions. But she'd already proven what she needed to prove, not to the doubters or the command structure or anyone else, but to herself. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Call sign Raven, flying into the dawn, carrying the gun that kept soldiers alive and enemies afraid, embodying everything the A-10 was built for: resilience, precision, and the stubborn refusal to quit when things got hard. Below her, somewhere in those mountains, a convoy was moving through hostile territory, and they had no idea that an angel with titanium wings was watching over them. But if things went wrong, if the bullets started flying and the situation got desperate, they'd find out. Because Raven was on station, and she'd already proven she'd stay as long as they needed her, no matter what it cost. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze, and the war continued its ancient rhythm of violence and survival. And somewhere in that vast machinery of conflict, one pilot and one aircraft had become something more than their individual parts, a story that would be told in ready rooms and briefing halls for years to come, a reminder that sometimes the impossible was just another word for determined. The radio crackled with routine calls, and Raven settled into her patrol pattern, eyes scanning the ground below, finger resting lightly beside the trigger, ready for whatever came next. The story officially was over. The commander had been wrong, the pilot had survived, but the real story, the one that mattered, was just beginning, written in every future mission. Every pilot who heard what happened and pushed a little harder, flew a little longer, refused to give up a little more stubbornly. That story would never end as long as there were people like Raven willing to climb into a cockpit and take on impossible odds. And the sky, infinite and indifferent, bore witness to it all.